The city lights faded behind him as James drove down the narrow road leading to the countryside. The luxury car he once loved now felt too heavy with memories of boardrooms, contracts, and betrayal. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his heart pounding with uncertainty. Everything he had built, his career, his company, his reputation, was gone. But ahead of him, beyond the misty fields and quiet lanes, was the only thing that still made sense: Diep and Little Nhi. He could still remember the moment he walked out of his father's office, his resignation letter trembling in his hand. His father's voice echoed in his ears, cold and final. "You're making a mistake, James. You're throwing your future away for a woman and her child that aren't even yours." But James didn't look back. Maybe it was foolish, maybe even reckless, but his heart knew what it wanted. When he arrived at the small house that Diep rented, she was outside, hanging laundry under the golden sunset. Her smile was soft, pure, and real, something money could never buy. "James?" she called out in surprise, wiping her hands on her apron. "You came earlier than I thought." James stepped out of the car, his eyes lingering on her face as though he hadn't seen her in years. "I came home," he said quietly, and for the first time in a long while, the word home didn't mean his family mansion or his company office. It meant her. Inside, Little Nhi ran up to him, holding her toy duck. "Uncle James, did you bring chocolate?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. James laughed and pulled a small bar from his pocket. "Of course I did. I could never forget you." That night, they had dinner together: simple rice, vegetables, and soup that Diep made with her own hands. There was no wine, no silverware, no candlelight, just warmth. The sound of Nhi's laughter filled the room. For a moment, James forgot the chaos he had left behind. Later, when Diep was washing the dishes, James sat on the old wooden step outside the house, staring up at the stars. They looked so close here, so real, so unlike the cold, distant skyline he used to see from his penthouse. Diep came out quietly and sat beside him, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "You seem quiet," she said softly. James smiled faintly. "I'm just thinking if I did the right thing." Diep looked at him, her eyes gentle. "You left everything for peace, didn't you? For love?" He nodded slowly. "Yes. But what if I can't give you the life you deserve?" Diep shook her head, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "James, you've already given me more than money ever could: a sense of safety, of being seen, of being loved. That's worth more than anything you left behind." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying her words into the night. James turned to look at her, this woman who had nothing but a heart so strong it could carry both of them. And as Nhi's laughter echoed faintly from inside, he realized something deep within. Maybe he didn't lose everything. Maybe, for the first time, he had truly found it. "Breakfast is ready," Diep called softly. Her voice had a warmth that melted the cold edges of his restless thoughts. James sat at the table, his eyes lingering on the simple meal: porridge, pickled vegetables, and a small plate of eggs. He smiled faintly. It wasn't the lavish breakfast he once had served by hotel chefs, but it tasted better, more real. Nhi climbed into her chair beside him, her hair tied into two little braids. "Uncle James, are you going to work today?" she asked innocently. James froze for a moment, the spoon halfway to his mouth. "Work?" he murmured. He had no job now, no office, no employees, no boardroom waiting for him. Diep looked up, sensing his hesitation. "He'll work here today," she said gently. "We've got a lot to do in the garden." James looked at her and smiled in silent gratitude. She had a way of protecting him, of turning even his losses into something peaceful. After breakfast, they went outside together. The garden stretched behind the small house, green and hopeful under the soft morning sun. James rolled up his sleeves and began helping Diep fix the wooden fence. The once smooth hands that signed million-dollar deals were now covered in dirt and scratches. Every nail he hammered felt like a strange kind of redemption. Diep watched him quietly. There was something beautiful about the way he worked: careful, focused, determined to belong in this new world. "You're learning fast," she teased. James laughed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I used to build empires," he said, but I never built a fence before." Diep smiled, handing him a glass of cool water. "Maybe this fence will last longer than your empire," she said softly, and he couldn't help but think she might be right. Days turned into weeks, and James slowly began adjusting to this simpler life. He sold the last of his luxury watches to buy tools and supplies for the small farm. Together, he and Diep planted rows of corn, beans, and sweet potatoes. Nhi would run around laughing, chasing butterflies while they worked. But reality wasn't always kind. There were nights when James sat awake, staring at the empty balance in his bank account. The savings he had left were fading faster than he expected. The weather ruined their first harvest. Buyers in the nearby market refused to pay fair prices. One evening, after a long day under the sun, James sat quietly on the porch, his shoulders heavy with fatigue. Diep came out carrying 2 cups of tea. "You're tired," she said, sitting beside him. He nodded. "I thought I could start over easily. I thought leaving everything behind would bring peace. But sometimes, I wonder if I've made the biggest mistake of my life." Diep placed her hand gently over his. "Mistakes are when you give up. James, you haven't given up yet. You're still fighting, and that's what matters." Her words sank deep into his heart. He turned to look at her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something greater than faith. Behind them, Nhi's laughter echoed from the room as she played with her stuffed bear. The sound was small, but it carried warmth through the night air. James smiled faintly. Maybe he didn't have the world anymore, but here, in this tiny home, he had something worth more than gold, a family. As the stars began to appear, Diep leaned her head on his shoulder. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together," she whispered. James looked at the horizon, where darkness met light. "Together," he repeated softly, and for that single moment, the weight of his choices didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like destiny beginning again. The days grew shorter, and the cool breath of autumn crept across the fields. The small farm that once looked full of hope now stood quiet and weary after weeks of rain. The corn stalks bent low, and the sweet potatoes that James and Diep had worked so hard to plant were now rotting beneath the muddy soil. James stood at the edge of the garden, his boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. His hands were rough, his shoulders tense, his eyes distant. The man who once stood tall in front of hundreds of employees now looked like a simple farmer who had lost his harvest stand, maybe his dream. From the doorway, Diep watched him. She knew that look. It was the same one he had when he first told her he'd been disowned. The same silent storm that lived behind his calm eyes. She walked over, her steps soft on the damp earth. "Don't stay out here too long," she said gently. "You'll catch a cold." James didn't answer. He stared at the ruined crops, his jaw tight. "All of it," he muttered. "Months of work, gone in 3 days of rain." Diep sighed quietly. "We can start again. We always can." He turned to her, his voice low. "You say that like it's easy. You don't understand, Diep. I gave up everything, my company, my name, my future. And now I can't even grow enough food to feed us properly." Her expression softened, but her voice remained steady. "You didn't give up your future, James. You just chose a different one." He looked at her then, and for a moment, anger flickered behind his eyes, not at her, but at himself. "A future where I can't provide for you or Nhi. A future where I have to borrow money just to buy seeds." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration pouring out. "Maybe everyone was right. Maybe I did make a huge mistake." Diep stepped closer and placed her hands on his chest, forcing him to look at her. "No, James. The mistake would have been staying in that world that broke you. The mistake would have been choosing money over love." Her words cut through the noise in his mind, calm but powerful. The rain started to fall again, light and soft, landing on their faces as if the sky itself was listening. Inside the house, Nhi's laughter echoed faintly as she played with their new puppy, Don. That small, joyful sound pulled James back from the edge of his doubts. He took a deep breath. "You always know what to say," he murmured. Diep smiled faintly. "No, I just know what's true." Later that evening, they sat together at the wooden table, eating plain rice and pickled vegetables. The roof leaked a little, and the candle flickered weakly between them, but Diep still smiled. She talked about the new seeds she wanted to try, about maybe building a small greenhouse. James watched her, wondering how someone who had so little could still shine so brightly. He realized something then, that wealth wasn't measured in dollars or properties. It was in strength, in kindness, in the quiet way Diep made even broken things beautiful again. At the market, an old farmer approached him. "You're the one who used to run those big companies, right?" the man said, squinting under the sun. James nodded silently. The farmer smiled, handing him a small bundle of healthy seedlings. "Start again. You've got good hands. The earth doesn't care how rich you were, it only cares how much heart you give it." James looked at the old man, speechless for a moment, then nodded with gratitude. That night, he brought the seedlings home. Diep was sitting on the porch with Nhi, telling her stories about the moon. When James showed her the small bundle, her eyes lit up. "See," she whispered, "every ending can be a beginning." James knelt beside her, watching Nhi fall asleep in her lap. "I'm starting to believe that," he said softly. And for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like a failure. He felt like a man rebuilding not his wealth, but his purpose. The winter that followed was harsh. The cold winds swept through the small house, rattling the windows and seeping into every crack of wood and wall. But inside, the warmth of family filled the air, a quiet fire burning not just in the hearth, but in their hearts. James woke up before sunrise each day, his breath visible in the frigid air. He worked on the fields, fixing fences, planting new seeds, and helping the villagers with their chores in exchange for a few coins. His once smooth hands were now covered with calluses, his skin roughened by the sun and wind. Yet every time he returned home, Diep would greet him with that same gentle smile, the one that made all exhaustion disappear. One evening, as the snow began to fall softly outside, Diep sat by the window, sewing a small jacket for Nhi. James came in, his clothes damp, a faint chill clinging to him. He placed a small envelope on the table. "What's that?" Diep asked. Curious, he smiled faintly. "The first payment from the greenhouse project. We sold the first batch of vegetables today." Diep's eyes widened. She covered her mouth in surprise, tears welling up. "James, you did it." "We did it," he corrected, reaching out to touch her hand. "Without you, I wouldn't have made it through a single season." In that moment, silence filled the room, not empty or cold, but full of peace, the kind of silence that comes only after a storm has passed. Days turned into weeks, and the little greenhouse behind their house began to thrive. Neighbors who once mocked James now came to ask for advice. Some even wanted to work with him. Slowly, life began to shift again, not toward luxury, but toward meaning. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Diep found James sitting on the porch, Nhi asleep in his arms. The golden light touched his face, making him look like the man she had first fallen in love with, proud, strong, but gentler now, grounded by love rather than ambition. "You know," she said softly, sitting beside him, "I used to be afraid that you'd regret leaving everything behind." James looked down at Nhi, brushing a strand of hair from her tiny forehead. "I did, once," he admitted. "When things got hard, I thought I'd ruined everything. But now I see what I would have lost if I hadn't left." He turned to Diep, his voice tender. "I would have lost this. You her. The kind of life that can't be bought." Diep leaned her head on his shoulder. "Then maybe," she whispered, "you didn't make a mistake after all." James smiled. The sound of the wind outside had softened, replaced by the faint chirping of crickets, the promise of spring. That night, as they sat together under the stars, Diep suddenly said, "You always wanted to build something that would last forever, right?" "Yes," James replied, glancing at her curiously. She smiled. "You already have. It's us." He said nothing, just wrapped his arm around her as Nhi stirred in his lap. The stars shimmered above them like tiny witnesses of their quiet victory. A victory not over the world, but over doubt, fear, and pride.